evening. Call to order the City of Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for Wednesday, July 11th, 2018. Ms. Howard, if we could have the roll call, please.
Adkins.
Here.
Arnson.
Here.
Giarrusso.
Here.
Hartley.
Here.
Holst. Leeper.
Here.
Oberly.
Here.
Saul.
Here.
Wingert.
Thank you. Next is approval of our minutes from our June 27th meeting. Are there any comments or corrections on those meeting minutes? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve?
So move.
Is there a second? Motion is second for approval. All those in favor of approval signify with aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? Thank you, our minutes are approved. At this point, we'd like to open the floor for any general public comments to the commission. Seeing none, we'll move on. We have no items of new business, but the next items on our agenda are a pair of public hearings. These are open public hearings continuing from our last meeting. The first of these is a rezoning for the southwest corner of Highway 58th and West Ridgeway Avenue. And Mr. Graham, are you introducing this item, right?
Yep.
Thank you.
Again, so this was introduced, the public hearing at the last meeting 2 weeks ago, and this is a continuation of the hearing for the rezoning from A1 to Highway 1. And this is located at the southwest corner of Highway 58 and West Ridgeway Avenue. Again, here on the location map, you can kind of see it's bounded by Highway 58 on the east, Highway 20 on the south, and Ridgeway Avenue on the north. And there is a mobile home park located directly to the west. Again, they did submit a concept plan with the rezoning application. Again, this would be for a commercial development with a main 185,000 square foot retail business with a 72,000 square foot storage yard. 3 additional tenants in a retail building to the north of that, a fuel center at the northeast corner, and then 2 potential outlots for development. Again, the site plan, the concept plan shows 2 accesses from Ridgeway Avenue, and again, no accesses from Highway 58 to the south or Highway 20, or Highway 58 to the east and Highway 20 to the south. Again, the plan does show some areas of wetlands, and they are minimally disturbing that. I believe it's less than a half an acre of disturbed wetlands, and that's just to allow for those access drives to get to the main property. And again, this plan does show some right-of-way needs at the southeast corner. It's approximately 11 acres or so for that the DOT has planned a future interchange at Highway 20 and Highway 58. So the developers are reserving that space as open space for potential future highway interchange. So again, when looking at rezone requests, we look at the future land use map. And what the future land use map shows for this area, it does show it as commercial corridor. A majority of this area is shown as that commercial corridor, so this rezoning request would be in conformance with the future land use map. And again, other things that are considered when you're looking at zoning requests are the utility locations, access locations. So again, there is sanitary sewer located along the north side of this property, and there is a water main located on the north side of Ridgeway Avenue that can be extended to the site. And then again, they are proposing the 2 accesses to the property. So this was brought up a little bit at the last P&Z meeting that they are working on submitting a traffic study, and the rezoning from A1 to Highway 1 will increase the traffic, the intensity of the use from agricultural as it sits now to a commercial development. Based on that, they're completing that traffic impact study so they can determine what kind of traffic impacts that this development will have. And then it'll also analyze what roadway improvements may be needed, whether that's a signal, whether it's a roundabout, whether it's turn lanes, both eastbound, westbound, and what those may entail. So we're still waiting for that traffic study. We've been working with the developers. They're working on it right now. It's not completed yet. And so what we want to do is staff would like to see that traffic study because any of the recommendations from that traffic study can potentially be put into any conditions with the rezoning request. State code does allow zoning requests to have conditions attached to them. So I think what the staff would like to do is see that traffic impact study, have a chance to review it, and see what kind of improvements might be recommended in order to potentially put those into formal conditions with approval of the zoning request. And again, because that study is not complete, we don't have the opportunity to review those and to provide any potential conditions for the zoning. So at this time, we would like to continue the public hearing to the next meeting. That will give the applicant a chance to complete the traffic study, submit the traffic study for review, and then have staff consider what conditions may be required to support the rezoning request, and then bring that back to the commission at its next meeting, and hopefully move that on to City Council once we have a little bit firmer grasp on what the analysis of that traffic study indicates and what conditions we may want to work with the developer on putting on the zoning conditions when we move it forward.
Thank you. At this point, we'll ask the applicant, invite the applicant if there are any comments you'd like to make. Thank you. Any other comments from the public? Commission, any additional questions for staff or for the applicant?
I believe this was the only thing we had questions on last time. I believe we talked through the land use and the map piece. That all seemed to make sense. So we really don't need to have that additional conversation as just the outcome of the traffic study. Is that how I recall this as being correct? Okay.
Anyone else?
Good.
Okay. We will continue the public hearing then for our next meeting at the August 8th commission meeting.
July 25th?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Look, jumping a little further ahead, July 25th. Thank you. Our next agenda item is another public hearing. This is also a continuation of a hearing that was opened at our last commission meeting. This is the rezoning and land use map amendment for 1015, 1021 West 22nd Street. And Ms. Howard, if you'd like to give us the background on this one.
Yes. Here's the map, the location map for the land use map amendment request and the rezoning request. As you can see here, the property are located in the College Hill Overlay District at the corner of College Street and West 22nd Street. Several properties, a sort of an L-shaped property for the larger mixed-use project, and then in this particular case, we're considering an application for a land use map amendment for the properties shown to the west. There's two properties that are currently zoned R3, and those have been requested to land use map amendment. And here you can see the current future land use map, and those properties that are zoned R3 are currently designated on the land use map as high density residential. And the request is to amend that land use map and change it from high density residential to neighborhood commercial mixed use, and then rezone the property to C3, which is the contiguous commercial zoned properties you can see to the east. I went through a number of things at the last meeting. I don't want to belabor a lot of these points, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. So I'm just going to run through these slides fairly quickly, and if there's any questions about them. But generally, the College Hill Neighborhood Plan, you can see an image of that here for the commercial district, showed a more cohesive and attractive commercial core surrounding a parking courtyard. And that plan was adopted in the 1993, so some time ago. And since then, we've adopted a more recent comprehensive plan update in 2012. And that plan states that to extend the streetscape along 22nd Street to improve the pedestrian access. And it's more guidance for mixed-use storefronts with apartment dwellings above, and bringing that mixed-use commercial development between 21st and 22nd Street. So more of an urban commercial goal for the College Hill Commercial District. So as we noted last time, there's been a shift in focus from commercial surrounding a parking court to encouraging mixed-use storefront buildings with apartment dwellings above and parking located on the street or behind the buildings with the goal to create a more walkable neighborhood commercial area. The proposal addresses the desire both for additional parking to serve the proposed mixed-use building on College Street, which will be considered later on the agenda, and to improve the streetscape on 22nd Street with a deeper setback so that parking is buffered then screened from the public sidewalk. The proposal is for a 25-foot setback area for a usable green space to try to achieve that more pedestrian-oriented character. And as in your packet, this is the concept for that setback of the commercial or of the parking lot from West 22nd Street with the green space and bicycle parking and bike share program in the front. So when we looked at the analysis of this rezoning request and comprehensive plan map amendment, staff finds that the proposed amendment to the future land use map will result in a reasonable balancing and advancement of the comprehensive plan goals, including providing land for additional parking to serve a mixed-use building in a manner that does not detract from the desired streetscape along 22nd Street, and facilitating development of mixed-use storefronts with apartment dwellings above, as called for in the comprehensive plan, and bringing additional mixed-use commercial development between 21st and 22nd Streets to link that upper hill and lower hill along College Street into a more walkable retail area. In addition, staff finds that the proposed amendment may spur additional walkable mixed-use development in the future, as proposed by the comprehensive plan, by reserving enough space at the front of the lot to allow for urban commercial or mixed-use infill to meet future market demand. So that's for the land use map amendment. And combining that with the rezoning request, the existing zoning is R3 multiple unit residential currently, and that current zoning is really unlikely to achieve, in staff's opinion, the comprehensive plan goals due to the provisions in that R3 district that call for larger front setbacks and limited residential densities. If we're to achieve that sort of mixed-use residential, mixed-use character in this area of College Hill, the R3 zoning probably is not going to help us achieve that. So the proposed zoning to C3, feel it is consistent with the comprehensive plan. It calls for urban commercial zoning, and this zoning designation is applied exclusively to downtown and to the College Hill district, and it does allow that mixed-use development that calls for in the comprehensive plan. So our analysis shows that it is consistent with the comprehensive plan, the 2012 comprehensive plan, and also the College Hill neighborhood plan, and allows the use of the property for parking also to serve upper floor residential in a mixed-use building, which are also called for in the comprehensive plan. So therefore, the Community Development Department recommends approval of an amendment to the future land use map from high-density residential to neighborhood commercial mixed use for properties located at 1015 and 1021 West 22nd Street, and also recommends approval of a rezoning of those same properties from R3 multiple residence district to C3 high-density commercial. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Aren't any immediate questions? We'll go ahead and invite if the applicant would like to speak to this item. Please state your name and address.
Absolutely. Dan Drendel, Slingshot Architecture, 305 East Court Avenue in Des Moines. Speaking on the behalf of the applicant here tonight. Just to reiterate, I think what we've said before, we've appreciated collaborating with staff to bring a solution that starts to balance some of the comments that we've gotten on this project about adding parking, but also extending the streetscape and walkable nature of this street down 22nd to meet the comprehensive plan. So really our goal is to balance both. The design that you'll see in the next submittal provides pedestrian access to that parking without using the drive lane. The signage elements and the benches reflect the architecture that'll be at the front of the building as well to make that connection going down the streetscape. And we think it's going to be a good solution to help transition additional walkability down the street and start building that streetscape that we want to see going down 22nd Street that we discussed. So, here for any questions.
Thank you. At this point, we'll open up for any public comments. If you'd like to speak to this item, please come up to the microphone, state your name and address for the record.
Chris Warnemont, 415 and 1/2 Washington Street. My only concern is, I guess this is R3, and I know when I was on the rental task force, this came up. Could we, because at that point we were talking about taking bedrooms if you do not have off-street parking. So I said, could we turn a house into a parking lot, and that would suffice for the surrounding area to park in? That was absolutely not, Chris. It's not, we're not going to take a neighborhood and start turning it into parking lots. So I guess I would ask city staff, what's the difference here? To me, it seems like it's a spot zoning event. It's just two specific lots that are zoned, that are getting rezoned to become parking lots. And I thought the city was against that, at least the 11 years I've been here doing this. So obviously, this is going to set a precedent that going forward, is this what we're planning on doing? And if so, okay, so be it, but I would like that precedent set for everybody, so. Thank you.
Anyone else who'd like to speak to the item?
Hello, Dave Dibler. I live at 1616 Campus Street with my wife Barb and my son Owen. Had a long-time presence on College Hill. I run Octopus. My wife runs Mohair Pear, and I've been a resident up there for a long time. I'll keep it short. I'm in favor of this project. And I think one of the most important things I've seen as far as the display earlier was that this may spur other developments. And I think we are at a crossroads right now, and we're at a gateway. And if this is legal, then let's build it. Let's send it on to City Council. I want to keep this short, but I also want to say that Octopus has been open 6 years. I've never had one customer mention a parking problem to me. Now that's not a scientific study, but it is relevant to what we're talking about today. And I've never heard anybody at Mohair Pear. Granted, I have a demographic at my businesses that's young. So I try to be a good neighbor and sensitive to what other people need. But the parking apocalypse we've discussed sometimes, I don't live that. I don't know where it's coming from. So again, thanks for your time on the careful consideration on this. I appreciate it. So let's build this thing. Thank you.
Sean Bajpay, 3831 Convair Lane, Cedar Falls, Iowa, on behalf of myself and my client. My only comment is really a question. I know from review of the public documents that there have been several official protests made to the rezoning, and I wondered if staff was going to speak to the effect of those protests, not necessarily on planning and zoning's decision, but what those effects would be in terms of council's decision, and whether or not this rezoning, which is providing 29 spots to a separate item where parking is a big concern, whether or not these are really linked, if they're not linked, and just kind of spur that conversation, because that's one thing I didn't hear from staff is what's up with all the protests and what's the effect on that. So.
Any other
Speak
comments?
to that issue if whenever
I
Commission
think-
wants.
Go ahead. I think we'll see if anyone else needs to comment, but go ahead and address that.
The city has received a couple protest petitions from two property owners that own property within 200 feet of the boundaries of this property. So they own enough property surrounding this to trigger a valid protest. So what that means is at the city council level, when they're making a decision for the rezoning and the comprehensive plan, or for the rezoning application, that would trigger a supermajority vote of the council to approve the rezoning. Now, that doesn't affect the site plan or the comp plan amendment, are not affected by the protest, but of course they are relevant and associated with this whole project, so.
Any other comments from the public?
My name's Cara Bigelow Baker. I live at 1826 Quail Run Lane in Cedar Falls, and I do business at the Razor's Edge on College Hill. I don't necessarily have a problem with rezoning the 2 lots to C3. I understand the future growth and development of trying to enhance the hill. My concern is spot zoning. Like was mentioned earlier, I don't understand how you could rezone 2 lots in between other lots and not open up a loophole. Loopholes, as we have seen, particularly with the same developer, get re-exposed and reopened. And loopholes, whether it's with this project or another project down the line, a lot of times require Band-Aids. And those Band-Aids don't come without painful experiences and expense. So those are my concerns, that if this is going to be considered, that everything is taken into consideration when looking at it. Is off-site parking even a solution for a project that the zoning hasn't been determined? Is it going to be commercial? Is it going to be residential? I don't know if we're putting the cart before the horse, but spot zoning is a concern. So I think that if you're going to look at rezoning, you need to look at rezoning the area. And then you're also going to have to look at how is that rezoning going to affect the current property owners, and what does that mean for them? And are they going to be forced to make any changes? Or are they going to be able to live and let live until they decide that they want to make changes to their properties? Those are my general concerns at this time.
Thank you for your comments and questions. If there are any other comments, anyone else who'd like to speak to this item? I'd like to invite the applicant if you have any further comments or responses to make at this point.
Evening, everyone. I'm Matt Harden at 801 Grand Avenue in Des Moines for Faegre Baker Daniels. I'm the attorney for the developer. I just want to clarify one point on this for the rezoning. It's not our position that the rezoning is necessarily tied to the approval of the site plan for reasons we'll get into. I'm sure we'll get into in a few minutes here, but you know, our position, and it appears staff's position, has been that parking is not required for the site. Then the 29 spaces that are being provided at these 2 lots at 1015 and 1021, that those sites, you know, would not be required that for approval of the site plan or vice versa. If the site plan does not require parking, or if the main site does not require parking, then the extra 29 spaces, you know, should not be linked to that, and that whether we have 94 spaces or whether we have 65 spaces, the code still does not require parking in the first place, and so approval of this is kind of on its own, and the site plan approval is on its own as well, even though they are linked as part of the same project. If the approval of both is not, you know, are not tied together.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a comment on that. A couple points of clarification. With regard to the question about spot zoning, I think we had this question at the last meeting as well. The two properties requested for rezoning are contiguous with the boundary for the C3 district. So rezoning those two properties to C3 would not be considered an illegal spot zone because it is just an extension of the C3 district. I think there's some misunderstanding that the property in between these two properties and the main site for the mixed-use project has a residential use on it. However, that property is zoned commercial currently, so that boundary is contiguous, so would not be considered a spot zone. Then to the question about the several different cases that we have on the agenda tonight with regard to the site plan question and whether this is tied to the rezoning. If the property is rezoned, if you recommend it and the city council adopts a rezoning to C3 for these two properties and changes the land use map, that would allow these two properties to develop according to the C3 district within the College Hill Overlay District. So if, for example, the site plan fails at council or here, and but the rezoning is approved as appropriate, then those properties become zoned C3 and they're not tied to a specific site plan. However, it doesn't go the other way in staff's opinion. The applicant has presented a site plan for approval that includes the main site plus off-site parking. That's what they've requested. They've chosen to tie those two properties together, and while staff agrees that the parking is not required, they are offering it and offering it as a package. So if that site plan is approved, all the elements of that site plan as proposed are what are approved, and they must build that. If they decide they don't want to build that and want to build something different, or if, for example, they decide to uncouple that and not do the off-site parking, they could certainly propose an application to do that, another application for site plan review that would not include those adjacent properties. But that's why, for the site plan case at least, the two properties are tied together.
One of the other questions that has brought up as well as reference back to the rental code, and I think there was a little bit of discussion at our last meeting. Can staff address that item as well? The reduction in bedrooms with the change in the rental code, and I don't have the details or recall the exact details. The gentleman who spoke first, talking about, jump in, do you remember the?
Well, he was concerned about, they were not allowed to take down a rental house to put in a parking lot. And the city said, no way, we're not going to get rid of housing in favor of a parking lot. So that looks like sort of what we're doing, asking for now. So he's like, is this going to set a precedence for the future of the people in the R3 district up there?
So what the zoning ordinance states in the parking section is that it's got two different provisions. One provision states that it should be on-site, the parking should be on-site for a project, and then there's a further clarification for the C3 district that includes something for off-site parking, and then some conditions for off-site parking that it needs to be close to the property in question, and there's a number of, and it's allowed to be reviewed then off-site parking by the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council. So there's a little bit of gray area there for this in this particular case, and that's one of the reasons that staff feels that it does need to be rezoned to the same zone that the project is zoned as, and that because of the comprehensive plan and how it's shown parking to serve mixed-use development in a couple different ways. One, in the College Hill district, showing a lot of surface parking surrounded by the buildings. And then later in the 2012 update, it talks about parking located behind buildings or on the street to serve development and mixed-use development. So staff looked at that, and we did have some concerns about it, but that's why we're recommending that it be set back from the street to allow a future building in the front, It does set it back from the street to achieve that walkable character of the street. So it isn't your typical surface parking lot that's built right up to the public sidewalk. So we're kind of trying to balance some of those comprehensive plan goals and issues for this particular, in this particular case, in this particular area. I was not here in Cedar Falls for those previous cases, so I'm not familiar with the circumstances of that particular request or where exactly that was located.
Did we capture your question? Okay. Anyone else who wants to speak to the rezoning or the land use change at this point? Okay, at this point, we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed, bring it back to commission for any further discussion or questions.
Karen, I didn't double check this, and I don't know if I, and you may be repeating yourself, so I apologize, but the comprehensive plan for this area indicates that that is appropriate for the C3, right?
Right, you can see the map for
I
the
didn't double
College
check.
Hill
I
area
thought that was the case, but I didn't want to rely on my memory.
included commercial going further to the west, and then 2012.
It's already in our comprehensive plan, yeah, okay.
I think I asked the question about spot zoning last time. I thought you gave a good answer for everyone, but this is really the extension of a zone, not an island alone. And
That's
it's
correct.
consistent with the comprehensive plan. It seems to make sense.
Yeah, because I think I stated last time, I mean, I could see that C3 zoning growing in that area. I mean, that does seem appropriate.
Yes.
And that's, separate from whatever proposed uses and things like that, just from a zoning standpoint. That makes sense.
And I assume we need two separate motions, one for the land use map and one for the rezoning on this item.
I would move that we approve the zoning change.
Do you need us to start with land use or zoning?
Land use map, please. And then,
Or I move that we approve the land use map change.
So as proposed, it's a change from high-density residential to neighborhood commercial mixed use, the land use change. Is there a second?
I'd second that.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, please go ahead and vote. And we have all ayes on that item. So the second half of this item is the zoning change. Is there a motion for this portion?
I would move to change the zoning.
And as recommended, that is from the R3 multiple unit residential to R3 commercial district. Is there a second for that
Second.
motion? There's a motion and a second. Please go ahead and vote. And we have all ayes on that one. So both the land use change and the zoning change have been recommended by the commission. We'll move on to city council. So the next item on our agenda is a piece of old business. This is also a continuation from our June 27th meeting. This is the College Hill Neighborhood District, a site plan review now for 2119 College Street, and then also around the corner, 1015, 1021 West 22nd Street, the properties that we just addressed. So Ms. Howard, if you would give us the background on this, please.
so the proposal here is for a 5-story mixed-use building on property located at 2119 College Street, 925 West 22nd Street, and 1003 West 22nd Street. The proposal is for 2 retail storefront spaces on the ground level floor, about 10,765 square feet, 83 residential rental units on the upper floors, and on-site 65 on-site parking spaces, and 29 off-site parking spaces for a total of 94 spaces on-site for this property. And here is the site plan that was submitted for consideration. As I stated previously, this is the site plan, and so if this is approved, this is what will need to be built and complied with. And if the applicant, if somehow things change and they decide not to have the off-site parking, they are certainly welcome to submit a different application for a site plan, but this is the one under consideration today. I won't go through the details of the staff report, all the elements of a site plan and what's needed for approval, because there was specific questions about, at the last meeting, about how staff had interpreted the zoning ordinance and determined that parking was not required for upper floor commercial. And in the staff report, I kind of laid out several principles of statutory interpretation that staff was looking at when considering this. Now, there's clearly some differences of opinion about how these provisions of the zoning ordinance and the College Hill overlay should be read. And I just want to lay out the staff's analysis for this. So these general principles are that all language in the code is presumed to have meaning and effect. In other words, if the City Council has adopted specific provisions for a specific area, that means something. And that specific language then ordinarily would trump any conflicting general language in the code. So sometimes there are conflicts between provisions in an ordinance. Ordinance is written over time. Some parts of like an overlay district would if standards are more specific to that particular area, then those provisions would trump then the general language of the ordinance if there's a conflict. And then lastly, and very importantly, we would look to the legislative intent or the history of the particular ordinance that was adopted to clarify ambiguous text. So bear with me, I'm going to run through this in some detail just because of the concerns about this. So this is the language that's in the code. So in the C3 district, within the College Hill Overlay Zoning District, it states, in some cases, residential uses may be contained within principal commercial uses, and in such cases, the residential uses are considered to be secondary or accessory uses to the principal commercial use on the property. So and that's the introductory paragraph to that section of the code. And then under that paragraph, there's two paragraphs, additional paragraphs. The first paragraph deals with multi-unit buildings, so residential buildings, and talks about how parking is required and how they're discouraged in the commercial district, the C3 district in this area, and how for those types of buildings that they have to meet the setbacks and the parking requirements and that sort of thing for a residential building. And then in the second paragraph, it specifically refers back to these secondary or accessory residential uses described then in that introductory paragraph. So remember, in the introductory paragraph, it said residential uses, in the cases where they're within principal commercial uses, are considered to be secondary. And then we have a paragraph following that's under that paragraph that states, this is where we're going to talk about those secondary and accessory residential uses. And it states secondary or accessory residential uses to be established on the upper floors of principal permitted commercial uses are allowed. On-site parking will not be required for secondary accessory residential uses. No accessory or secondary residential use may be established on the main floor or street level floor of any storefront or commercial shop front of a principal permitted commercial building structure within the C3 commercial district. Furthermore, Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council review relating to the establishment of the secondary or accessory residential uses shall not be required unless the property owner proposes to utilize any portion of the ground floor area of the commercial use on a property for residential purposes. So we looked at this and said, here we have a commercial building. It's being proposed to be built to commercial standards. It's pulled close to the street. It's got storefront commercial on the ground level floor, which is a permitted principal use allowed in the C3 district. And here it also speaks to this idea that if it's going to have residential, it needs to be on the upper floors. It can't be on that ground level floor. Because if it's on the ground level floor, then that paragraph preceding this would apply, which would mean that it'd have to have parking and it'd have to be set back from the street. So that's how that paragraph reads to staff, and that's our interpretation of that. So going through those principles of statutory interpretation, that all language in the code is presumed to have meaning and effect, there is no question that the proposed building is built to commercial standards. It's designed to commercial building code standards and contains storefront commercial uses. It's designed so that the storefront areas are located directly adjacent to the public sidewalk to maximize that commercial activity and provide the walkable urban character and vision for the College Hill Business District. This is what a principal permitted use in the C3 district is intended to be. Any principal permitted commercial use listed in the zoning ordinance in the C3 district will be allowed to be located in those commercial spaces. Now and in the future, those could change over time. It could be a restaurant, and then it could change to a retail. So all the principal permitted uses allowed in the C3 district could locate on the ground level floor of this building. All language in the code is presumed to have meaning and effect. It appears that this is not only intentional that the upper floor residential uses be considered secondary to the principal commercial use in a storefront commercial building, but that the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council review of whether upper floor residential is allowed is not even required. Therefore, for property located in the C3 commercial district in the College Hill Overlay Zoning District, upper floor residential is considered an allowed secondary use in a building that contains a principal permitted commercial use, and there is not residential use on the ground level floor. Furthermore, parking is not required for such secondary residential use. That's staff's interpretation. And then on to that second principle of statutory interpretation. Specific statutory language ordinarily trumps conflicting general language. Now, there's been quite a bit of discussion about referring back to the definition section of the zoning ordinance that provides a general definition for accessory and principal use. However, in the case of the College Hill Overlay District and also in the Central Business District, are the two districts that have these words in them, accessory or secondary. So in those two districts, accessory is used differently and is equated with the term secondary, which is not defined, unfortunately, in the zoning ordinance. But it's clearly intended to refer to the uses located on the upper floors of a building designed with ground floor storefront commercial space. The specific statutory language in the College Hill Overlay Zoning District trumps any conflict or perceived conflict with the general language of the code, because to do otherwise would render the more specific language meaningless. And then finally, we would look to the legislative intent or history to clarify any ambiguous language. And there's been a lot of discussion about this. Clearly, maybe the language could have been written more clearly, and we wouldn't all be arguing about it today. But so we did look back at when that language was added to the code. That section that relates to the C3 commercial district in the College Hill Overlay was added in December of 2005. And at that time, there was a moratorium on multifamily construction in the College Hill district, and there was a lot of discussion about what the standards should be. And so at that time, there was several things added to the College Hill Overlay. All the design standards for the buildings were added, and then also this separate section for the commercial district, the C3 commercial district. And when we looked back through the history of that, in an early draft of the proposed legislation, that paragraph 29-160G did have language requiring parking for the upper floor residential uses in a building with ground level commercial use, but at a lower ratio than was required for multifamily buildings. However, at some point during the legislative review process, this language was modified, eliminating that requirement. So they had in the initial draft a requirement for parking, but at a lower ratio than for multifamily. And then there was more discussion at committee meetings, and that language was then modified. And that modified language was what was considered by the city council and then ultimately adopted. So therefore, it is clear that the language exempting parking for upper floor residential uses was intentional. It was reviewed and approved by the city council and should not be viewed as a mere oversight or as ambiguous language that can be superseded by the general language in other sections of the zoning ordinance. Is there any questions about all of that?
Well, I'd make a comment. I trailed through your whole, and I understand how you're getting there. I'm still a little uncomfortable with that because I was on the commission in 2005 when all this happened, and that's not intention. I don't know if it's clear intention because I don't have a recollection of that being a clear intention that way. I understand how you're getting there. I still struggle with this whole classifying as commercial. I think there's ambiguity there because we're clearly to a point. I mean, if we were so sure the code was exactly right in this manner, we wouldn't be even talking about this. But I think we all understand that this many apartments has to have some sort of parking, and zero's not the right answer. And I just wish we would go and kind of address that before, because otherwise, I mean, we're setting a different precedent than what we had before, because the previous project there did provide the parking. This would be the first one where we didn't meet that parking standard. So that's kind of been that's been the precedent. I mean, I understand how you're walking through this, and and unfortunately, I can see that, but I'm still struggling with the intent and the real, what's happened. I wish we'd rather than doing this on a project, we resolve this as a code thing, and then projects can fall into that. I think I'm just worried about approving something. This is in between, right? I mean, it doesn't meet the parking code. We say it's not required. Well, what's the next project going to be? Because it seems like it is a problem.
So I would say that what we've tried to do is find out what the zoning code actually says and what the law is here. And by looking back and this really, finding this history of this, it was clearly intentionally taken out. It was in an early draft and then taken out. There's a lot of discussion. There was a lot of different meetings at the time. It was very controversial, I believe, just looking at the process, that it was a 6-month moratorium that occurred. And I'm sure that you were, remember it.
Well, yeah, it's just very controversial. There's lots of different moving
that,
parts to it too. Yeah.
Ultimately, what the council adopted was what we have in the code now, which we just ran through that language. So that's what staff believes is what the law says. And then to the other point, which is there's a lot of question about what the parking requirement should be and whether the current code is what it should be, and whether we should amend it to require parking for residential. And all those questions are valid questions. And I think what the applicant has tried to do is say, okay, well, we don't think we were required to have parking, but we'll provide a significant amount of parking to serve the upper floor residential uses in this building. So they've tried to address the parking demand issue, but that doesn't speak to what the code actually says. So that's what we tried to provide for you.
So, yeah, if there's any other questions immediately for Karen, otherwise we'll go back to our process. Do you want to?
I do have a question. So what does principal mean? You told me what secondary and accessory means, and I understand that. So in the code, what does principal mean? In my definition that I understand is that it's the first, the main, the first order of importance. And when I look at this project, the first order of importance is residential. It is not commercial. So can you tell me, is there a different definition of principal for us to look at?
Well, I think you can often have more than one principal use on a piece of property. And I think when I see the words principal permitted use in the zone, if you look in the zoning ordinance, so there's a whole list of principal permitted uses allowed in any particular zone. So all of those would be considered, in other words, a restaurant that would go in there would have no association then with other uses in the building. And that's one of the reasons it's called a mixed-use building, is there's a mixture of uses. So that is a little bit confusing, but I would say that it is built to commercial standards. It's built as commercial storefront space that allows a lot of permitted principal uses allowed in that, commercial uses allowed in the zone.
I guess I would disagree with that in terms of the percentage of the use of the building. Because the greater percentage use of the building is not commercial on the first floor. It's the greater percentage purpose of the building is residential.
On the first floor.
Well, it doesn't state that though, first floor. Where does it exactly state the first floor only? I guess that's the question I have. I can see why in 2005 they had this discussion about because most of the buildings up there are 2 or 3 stories tall. They're not 4 and 5 and 6 stories tall. So I understand that change in that ordinance, but this is a much different look. This is a 5-story building.
Well, I would go back to the language here. And what it says is, in some cases, residential uses may be contained within principal commercial uses, and in such cases, those residential uses are considered to be secondary. And then it goes on to that second paragraph that talks about upper floor residential. And there may be other ways that things are principal uses. It might be considered principal if it's generating more traffic, if it's generating more public activity on the ground level floor. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could consider what is or isn't a main use of the building.
But it doesn't say principal use of first floor. What you just read does not say principal use of first floor.
There's a lot of ambiguity there.
There's a lot of ambiguity there.
So what it states in the second paragraph is no accessory or secondary residential use may be established on the main floor or street level floor of any storefront, commercial shop front. So I think they were trying to make a distinction between a commercial building with commercial on the ground floor that then can be set close to the street versus a multifamily building which was set back and has different development standards applied to it. It wouldn't really make sense for this to be considered a totally principal residential use, because then the whole building here, you'd have a storefront building that was built to commercial standards that would be set back 30 feet from the street. And it seems a little nonsensical that that would be the case, that what this was intended to be.
You could have the commercial right up on the street and have the residential portion set back 30 feet.
Now, I also struggle with the definition between primary and secondary, because I consider primary as the primary or the purpose of the building, and secondary or accessory is extra, and you would still go forward with the building if you didn't have any of the secondary or accessory. And that's why I struggle with this project, because I don't believe that this project would go forward if there wasn't the secondary use or the use on the upper floors, that this project would not survive as a primary commercial project without those secondary uses. And when I look at primary, I think of it being able to stand alone without those secondary accessory uses, that they're extra icing on the top, but not the primary core of the project.
I would ask that we maybe get public comment before the council.
I think
discussion.
these questions, maybe we'll continue this discussion following the public comment. And again, we'll follow our same process and invite the applicant to speak to the item first, and then open it up for others present to speak to this item.
Matt Harden for the applicant. This project does actually meet the parking code. The kind of the linchpin here, as you all have illuminated over the last few minutes, is what the principal use is. And if the principal use is commercial, the code at least is very clear on that if the principal use is commercial, then no parking is required. And I do want to stress that this process has gone on for about 1.5 years, and that's a very good thing to have that close relationship, working with the city, working with the commission. And again, thank you very much for your time and listening to this. I think this is maybe the 4th time you guys have heard this. But, you know, our client has really tried very hard to be good neighbors here and to be a good partner, amiable partner with the city, and has tried to address concerns from this commission, from the city council about parking and adding, I think it started out with 30 or 40 spaces and then increased to 65 and then increased to now 94 spaces. And so we've been trying to reach a compromise here. But if the principal use is commercial, then no parking is required, and it does meet the parking code. So as I said before, if the linchpin here is the principal use, then I think Ms. Howard did a very good job going through statutory interpretation about what they look to, the meanings of items in the code, and also looking at past practice history. The past precedent here and consistency is very important, and this is the manner of deciding the principal use of the property as commercial by looking at the first floor has been used 4 or 5 or 6 times. I have to look at the site plan review on that. And it's important that consistency and that precedent continue. As far as looking at the intent of the code and looking at when mixed use comes up in the code, you see it in the College Hill Revitalization Plan. You see it in the introduction to the College Hill Overlay. Whenever there is a reference to mixed use and there's a reference to residential and commercial mixing together, it always talks about it in terms of commercial on the first floor, commercial as the principal use, residential on the second and upper floors, residential as the secondary use. There is no kind of opposite situation where they talk about primary residential use and a secondary commercial use. That does not come up in the overlay, and so it seems to be that the intent of that part of the code is to make it so that we're building mixed-use buildings, commercial on the first floor, apartments above. And one other item here is that the definition of principal use, and I know that this has been debated and discussed. What does principal use mean? Well, there is a definition of principal use in the code. It says the main use, and then we talk about what's the main use, and one way that's been thrown out is the overall square footage of the building, but the vast majority of the public, the vast majority of the people who will encounter this building will go through the commercial aspect of it, because this is going to be retail space most likely. And when you're going on the street level, when you're entering this building, the vast majority of the people who see it, who use it, are going to be using the commercial space of it. So for them, for the vast majority of the public, it's a commercial building, it's a commercial space. Another reason that the main use is the same as the commercial use here is, again, going back to past precedent. If main use is not defined, then the safe bet, I think, is to go to what the staff has interpreted it from their expertise and their practice over the past several years in interpreting this as the majority of the first floor. And then finally, when you look at section 29-160 G2, it talks about the secondary residential uses located on upper floors of principal commercial uses are allowed, and that no residential use can be located on the main floor or the street level. So the main floor is seen as what the commercial level is, the street level, that main floor, main use. So this has been ruled on multiple times by the staff in the past, and this is their common practice. And the type of project that this code clearly intends to contemplate, that is what this building is. It's a mixed-use building, first floor commercial, upper floors being residential. Thank you very much. And I can take any questions if you want, or I don't know what the process is here, if we go on to public
If we have any immediate
comments.
questions, we'll give you a chance to respond to any
Sure,
other
thanks.
comments. Invite other members of the public to please address the commission.
Dr. Sires, 1939 College Street. This reminds me of the old Groucho Marx saying, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? There's a lot of argument about a lot of detail in an extensive code. But the practical matter is that the whole argument is really over what is the principal use of this building. Anyone walking up to it who looks at it and realizes there are 4 floors of residential and a partial floor of commercial are all going to say, this is a residential building. This is an apartment building. That's what it is. It should be called what it is. The code understands that. I had to read the code 4 or 5 times before I got the picture of how it works. And the way that it works is it defines what a building is, and then it tells you what to do with each building. Now, I've had 5 different lawyers on this, and they all tell me this is incorrect, what's being proposed to you. They are telling me that we have the correct interpretation, including a prior Cedar Falls city attorney who sent a letter to the city council indicating that our interpretation is the correct one. Something that everybody leaves out in here is that throughout the language of the code, there are portions, for instance, within the overlay and within the definitions that say wherever 2 portions of codes that seem to overlie one another seem to conflict, the more stringent applies. So if you look at the code, starting with where you're supposed to start, which is definitions is like 29(2) or 3, it's right at the beginning. That's where it tells you how to define this thing. Now, Ms. Howard has done an admirable job of surmising what she thought other people have thought. Mr. Holtz has indicated that that's not necessarily accurate, although he can't remember either. But the practical matter is these lawyers say, doesn't really matter what's happened in the past. You don't set precedent if you make a mistake. What matters is the written code. And the written code says the principal use of this building is residential. If you take it by square footage, if you take it by the economic return, it's a principal residential building. The developer, who I think everybody likes, I certainly have nothing against him personally or professionally. I've done business with him. Good guy, wants to build a building, and it would be unreasonable for his situation not to try to get the best thing he can. So he's going to try to do that, and every businessman should. But the city code is the law of the city, and you have to look at what is actually written there, not what you believe other people think. So the other thing I'd like to point out, and then I'll be done, is that we keep seeing these sections that say secondary residential is allowed above principal commercial. It is. It's allowed above principal commercial. But this is a principally residential building. It's not a principally commercial building. And if you can't see that, then you've had the wool pulled over your eyes. This is what it is. And it's as simple as that. And all the other process that goes on is just process. And you're missing the fundamental point of what the code is saying, the way it's built and the way the code is interpreted. And I understand that, this lawyer over here, may sue you over it. They're finally getting tired of it. I fought the city for a 1-foot variance for 1.5 years. So these things go on for long periods of time. But the truth of the matter is If you're facing a lawsuit and you're on the side of a prior Cedar Falls city attorney, you're probably not going to get hurt too badly. I read the code. It's very clear. It's a principal residential building. After that, it all falls out. Everything is set. Thanks.
Ishan Vajpayee, 3831 Conver Lane, Cedar Falls, Iowa. I always come with prepared notes and then I make more notes, so I'll start with the ones I just made. Look at all the gymnastics, all the turning of words on their side in their head. One is bigger than four. 4 floors of residential is secondary principal. Because it's built to a commercial building code standard, that makes it commercial. That doesn't, there's nowhere in the code that it says that. That the first floor determines the use, there's nowhere in the code that says that. They have to look to the legislative intent. They have to look to what this commission might have done 10, 20 years ago to find that out. And it's all very confusing the way they pose it. And it has to be, because that's the only way to reach their interpretation. And it's nice that we were provided statutory principles of statutory interpretation, but you don't start looking to legislative intent. You don't start reading the tea leaves unless you have an ambiguous code, unless you have a code whose words you can't discern the meaning of. But we don't have an ambiguous code here. We have a code that makes you make the decision between what is a principal use of this building and what is a secondary use of this building. And principal use is defined by the code, and the law of this state says that you can look to the dictionary for further clarification, and I've cited that definition. Principal use equals main use. What does main mean? Chief in size or importance. So we could measure that any number of ways, and I'll kind of get to what was brought forward by opposing counsel there on that. But this has to stop. This slippery slope, this presentation from staff that just doesn't, it's not the, you know, they say the simplest solution is the best. The simplest explanation probably is the best one. When you have to start jumping through all these hoops to make it work, it makes you kind of wonder, is this really what the code says? If you have to jump through all these hoops to make it work. Before I forget, I want to talk about this idea that, well, maybe the most foot traffic will come through to the commercial zone, the commercial portion of this, and that could maybe make it principal. There could be 2 principal uses of a building. Is that what I heard? Does that make sense? Think about what makes sense. We don't know what these retail spaces are going to be. Keep that in mind, too. So what if they put an office in there? How many people are going to go into that office? You know, what if one of the spaces lays vacant for several months? How many people are going to go in there? Then how are people going to see this building as they interact with it? A vacant commercial space, an office space, and then 4 floors of residential. There probably are many different ways to think about what's the principal or main use of the building. But if you think about all of them, there's way more in favor of this being principal residential than principal commercial. Income, size, square footage, public perception. What are people going to do? Walk by it and say, yeah, that big old office building on the corner of 22nd and College, they're going to say that apartment building, which, you know, maybe has a freshie in the bottom of it. Maybe. Working with staff, I'm sure that everybody appreciates cooperation, but like I said last time, the applicant wants to frame this as some sort of a negotiation. Like we should be happy that he's proposing 94 spots. Like we should be happy that he's proposing 65. Because that's what you're probably going to hear eventually. Well, we can't get this rezoned maybe, so we only need 65. It's not a negotiation. The code says how many spots you need, and I'm not gonna pull out my floppy little chart like I did last time that shows how many spots are required by R4, but it's 196 spots. Not even close. Okay. Like I said, this is simple. When I was preparing for my remarks, I was thinking, I'm gonna make this big flow chart, this big decision chart. Gotta do this, gotta do this, gotta do this to get here, to get here, to get here. I realized I don't have to do that, because it's simple. The question is whether it's principal, use as commercial, or residential. Look to the common sense usage of words. What does principal mean? We talked about it. Code section 29.2, the main use of the land or structure as distinguished from the residential use, or from the accessory use. We know that this is 1 floor of commercial space with 4 floors of residential on top. We know it's 5.75 times more residential square footage than commercial footage. This idea that this is the type of building that had to have been contemplated by the comprehensive plan, that you couldn't ever have a mixed-use building if you simply went off, if you didn't go off the ground floor. Incorrect. I can envision plenty in my head. You could put a commercial space, 1 floor, and you could build maybe 2 floors of apartments on top. If you put 1 bedroom, a big nice studio on the 1st floor and a big nice studio on the top floor, so maybe 4 people max are gonna live in there, that would be secondary residential. Don't let them frame this as this is what it is. That if you vote against this, you're voting against the comprehensive plan. You're voting against the future of mixed-use buildings in these districts. They're not talking about putting 20 units on top of this. They're talking about putting 120 beds on top of it, as many as possible, presumably to reap as much residential profit as possible. As Dr. Sires said, and this is what staff keeps saying, but they're skipping a step. They keep telling you secondary or accessory residential uses on top of the 1st floor of a principal commercial use are allowed. True, but step back. The first step, you don't put a cake in the oven before you mix the ingredients, right? The first step is the residential use secondary? Is the commercial use principal? They're skipping that step every single time I've been here. They're skipping the step, and they can't tell you where there's a different definition for principal in the code, and they can't tell you where there's a definition in the code that says you base it on the 1st floor. They just keep going back to that section and skipping the step of determining the use of the building. The applicant's attorney's argument, with all due respect, is generally to say, well, we agree with staff. Great. You don't have to agree with staff if it doesn't make sense, if you feel like it doesn't meet the code. The real-life implications, well, let's talk about this precedent. 5 or 6 examples, I don't think that's accurate. I think it's about 4 examples in the College Hill overlay, which is what we're talking about. And those examples are Sidecar Coffee, Domino's Pizza, Urban Flats, and this. So let's watch this slippery slope as it starts. Domino's Pizza and Sidecar Coffee, 1 floor of commercial, 1 floor of residential. Creep on down a couple more years. Urban Flats, 1 floor of commercial, 2 floors of residential above it. Some weird compromise on parking that we're going to piggyback off the UNI lots, and I'm going to get to that later. And here we are now. 1 floor of commercial, 4 floors of residential. Where are we going to be next? That's where this is headed. This has got to stop. It's not precedent if it was illegal in the first place. The real-life implications of this are really serious, not life and death, but serious to this community. Cost. Who's going to build a parking ramp to bail out this underparked area when we're going to need it? Anyone who's been downtown knows how congested it is. They keep building and building and building. Do we want that to happen to College Hill? Do we want the taxpayers to have to bail it out? Do we want to haul butt 5 blocks in the middle of winter to walk to a desirable location on the hill? Maybe some will. The evidence they cite, too, that they don't need the parking that the code requires is Des Moines or Iowa City. Well, those towns have tons of ramps to start, and they're much more walkable. They want you to take their word for how many cars they think tenants will bring, but let's go to some different perspectives on how many cars these tenants are going to bring. These at least 120 tenants. In our material submitted is a past letter from Dan Manning, attorney, who previously represented Dr. Sires, and in that he stated a study done of 957 apartments in the College Hill area. 98% of those units had a car to them. 98% of tenants had a car. What's 98% of 120? Well, I'm not smart enough to do it, but maybe someone with a calculator can help me out. Maggie Miller, UNI student and Director of Governmental Relations, on February 5th, 2018, well, UNI student, Governmental Relations at UNI, told City Council, and this is a quote, "Every student I know that lives off campus owns a car. Most students, even that live on campus, own cars," close quote. Quote, "Once you move off campus, there's really not a way to live in the city without a car," close quote. The Gary Jones letter, and I don't know if you have it, previously cited by Dr. Sires. I have copies. And
Mr. Vajpayee, we do have copies.
We have,
Okay,
yeah.
you got it. I'm just going to read from one little portion there because you guys asked for more legal opinions. You asked for more information. And at this juncture, I'll point out that I asked 4 questions of city staff in my letter, and I don't know if you got answers to them, but I didn't. And I didn't hear them in the presentation either, to be honest. Gary Jones' letter was for a previous site plan. It was for this same project, but when they were proposing 65 spots. He said that allowing the determination of the principal use on the first floor will, quote, "invite anyone wishing to build a residential building in the College Hill area, a special overlay district, to simply ensure the first floor is set up for commercial uses," close quote. Then we know that's the golden ticket to not having to park. They proposed to piggyback off the UNI parking, and I've been trying to be very calm here to a certain extent, but I'm just going to call it out. They've submitted materials stating incorrectly, either intentionally or unintentionally, that students can obtain, off-campus students can obtain a B, C, or R lot permit. False. You've got that documentation in my letter from the UNI parking site. Off-campus students are allowed to get a B lot permit or an R lot permit. A B lot permit doesn't park overnight. An R lot permit parks overnight. The lot is over behind the dome and over behind the wellness center. But guess what? Only students who have classes scheduled after 4 p.m. get an R lot. So what are they going to do? Take a census every semester as to whether or not you still have your R lot? And what if you don't have your R lot anymore? You get to leave? Or do you get to park next to your building where all these kids are going to park? Because they're not going to trek from the dome to their apartment building. They're going to park in those lots. They're going to park on side streets. They're going to park on other people's lots. Maggie Miller again, bright young lady. Quote, "We've had the same problem with urban flats. The understanding, I guess, was that people living there would be students or faculty and would have a UNI parking permit. But the only place to park for UNI overnight is the R lot behind the dome. I respectfully suggest, and this is me talking now, that this commission think long and hard about what they're being told by this applicant, whether they can rely on those statements, And also, lastly, think about what you're being asked to conclude by this staff. You're being asked to conclude that the main use of a 5-story building with 1 floor of commercial and 4 floors of residential is a principal commercial building and not to park any of it. Because that's really what they're saying. You didn't have to park any of it. But we're supposed to be blessed by his offering of maybe 65 spots if the supermajority doesn't come through on the rezoning over there. Please stick to the plain and common sense meaning of the actual code provisions. I believe if you do that, you'll determine that this project requires parking consistent with R4 and is over 100 spaces short, and you'll be obligated to oppose the site plan. Thank you.
Continue the opportunity for comments.
Hello, my name is Lisa Sevchek. I live at 1421 Clay Street. I'm very passionate about this issue also. I've been watching it on Channel 15 at home, and I just decided, well, I'm just going to come down and talk about it myself. I totally agree with Dr. Sires and Mr. Vajpayee back there. Parking is really, really important. We've got a son that lives in Denver, Colorado. He used to live in this high-rise apartment building. You try to go visit him, you drive around and around and around to try to find a place to park. Maybe when you found a place to park, it was blocks away. Or maybe it was so small you had like a foot on each side of your car. And so, you know, after a while, 10 minutes, maybe you can get your car in there. But that was a problem. We've got a son that lives in Milwaukee, and he lives in a neighborhood where there's all these houses, and they've all been cut up into apartments. In his house, there were 4 apartments. So what you had to do was every other day it alternated which side of the street you could park on, and you had to call the city of Milwaukee to get a parking permit so you didn't get a ticket, just so you could park there. Cedar Falls is in such a great position. We don't have those problems yet. Why? Why would we want to set ourselves up to be in this terrible position like these other towns? And we don't have to. We can plan. We can make Cedar Falls to stay nice, just the way it is. So, I really want you to think strongly at that. Staff could be wrong with their interpretation on this. It sounds like they don't really know. Secondary use, when I was listening to that, I thought, wow, 4 floors is secondary. I heard this statement, the vast majority of people using it will be for commercial use. Well, like he said back there, we don't even know what commercial use would be. I totally disagree with that unless it's Walmart, okay? If it's Walmart, yes, that's probably going to bring a lot of people in the door. But, you don't even know what business is going to be there. Whenever I go out of town and I'm visiting other cities, I always compare them to Cedar Falls because it's kind of fun to kind of imagine what would it be like if I lived here or there, and I always come back to, I love Cedar Falls. Cedar Falls is a great place. And so, we need to keep that in mind. Let's not go down the road of these other places that have made these mistakes. We don't have to make these mistakes. Let's make sure there's adequate parking. I don't care if they do say it's 1 bedroom. There's going to be a lot of people that are 2 people in that 1-bedroom apartment. So I don't think you can necessarily say that, well, there's just 1 bedroom, there'll only be 1 car. So I think you need to keep that in mind also. Also, I've heard it said that according to the code or whatever she was quoting, you don't even have to consider that there will be parking required. I mean, that's really ludicrous. why would we want to have 4 stories of residential, 1 story of commercial, main use, but 4 stories of apartments with no parking? That makes absolutely no sense, and I can't see why the city would say that would be okay. Our city shouldn't be subsidizing parking for developers. The developers need to make sure there's enough parking for these apartments. Let's keep Cedar Falls a really nice place to live. Let's not go down the road of these other big cities, college towns who don't have enough parking for all the students and everybody else. Let's make sure that we make sure there's enough apartment parking for this building if it does come to pass. Thank you.
Any others who'd like to speak to the item? Invite the applicant to come back up and.
I'd like to just speak a little bit about some of the impacts that some of these conversation points would have on some of the other development and to the process that happened on the design of this project. I think it's kind of upsetting, really, to have people speculate what happened in a room. When we work with Brent and the development team, we always seek to meet with the city first and find out what the intent of the code is ahead of time. We're not designing things and then trying to force someone to accept it. So really, the process was was completely to go in and find out what the comprehensive plan says, and to find out what should happen on this street, and to find out what was intended. And so that mixed-use conversation that we're doing with a lot of success in the downtown was exactly what we were talking about going in here. So, that's how it was proposed. That's the truth of being in the room, and no one else can really speak to that. But I think, we really just have to stick to what the code says here, because there is precedent being set about what mixed-use buildings are in your city. And the code doesn't say it is what you experience walking up to it, or what a pedestrian would call the building, an apartment building or a commercial building or an office building, or the percentage. The percentage, if it really was that you had to be 50% or greater commercial on the first floor, if that's really how the precedent got set in your city, that would limit everything to 1 to 2 stories, because commercial retail space isn't going to exist up on a level 2. And then the development that's happening down in the downtown of 3- and 4-story buildings, that wouldn't meet that interpretation that you guys are after, or that some people have been talking about. So the State Street buildings, and they're more than 50% residential, but they are commercial use, and they've been passed through all of their approvals as commercial buildings. Mixed-use buildings, primary commercial, secondary residential. So there's very clear, completely parallel approvals of exactly that primary and secondary use. And I think it's really important, because when we've talked this group that's right here, when we've talked in some of those later sessions of your Planning and Zoning Commission, you've talked about that we hope we can get our urban blocks to fill in at 4 and 5 stories tall, mixed-use development. And so I just urge you not to set that precedent, and to continue with the interpretation that's very clear in the code language about that the secondary uses and residential floors can be secondary uses above commercial use. And I would point out, just, you guys are looking for specific words. I mean, floors, it's not floor. It's not one residential floor is available above the commercial in the overlay district. It says floors. The intent's really there. So I urge you guys to support this project and put it through to the council, and let us take this next step. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wes Owen. I live at 504 West 22nd Street. This is my neighborhood. I also am a builder, and I did a duplex on Olive. I was required to park 100% of my building. Why is this different?
Cara Bigelow Baker, 1826 Quail Run Lane. I work at the Razor's Edge on College Street. Have a little different perspective than maybe other people up there. I work with two men who have done business at the same location at the Razor's Edge since 1965. So they've seen all of the businesses turn over, literally. The OP wasn't the OP, it was a grocery store, and so on down the line. I used to have a salon at the bottom of the hill. I moved to where the Razor's Edge is now because there was a parking lot behind the building. There was no parking. There were 4 spaces in front of the building that I rented, and that was shared by 5 businesses. So the parking was crazy. And our customers would try to park at Quick Star. So people gravitate where they can find a space to park. And now that Urban Flats has gone in, those tenants park in the city lot overnight, and they continue to do so, as the architect for this project mentioned at the last meeting. And it's been addressed to City Council and to Planning and Zoning with no action done by the city to resolve that matter. A parking study was asked to be done last year by College Hill Partnership for the area. To my knowledge, that hasn't been conducted either. I had contacted UNI last year about how many parking passes they sell to students, just to corroborate the number of students with vehicles. And 2017 UNI enrollment was 11,907 students, and they had at that time sold over 9,000 parking permits. So at over 76%, that just gives you a rough idea that at least 76% of the students have cars and are buying parking permits, and many students don't even bother to buy a permit because UNI oversells permits and you can't find a place to park. My daughter would testify to that. So there is a parking issue. And I know that Ms. Saul asked during the last meeting, where would people park if the building's tenants all had vehicles and there were not enough spaces for all of these people? I don't know, because there is no street parking available in that area. They would have to park to the east because all of the street parking to the west is already taken up by the tenants who reside there currently. So there isn't parking available anywhere near that building for people that move in. And I can imagine that they would be frustrated. During the first College Hill Farmers Market, one of the tenants from Urban Flats yelled at the parking permit tenant to make sure that she didn't ticket his vehicle because he lives at Urban Flats and can park in the parking lot as long as he wants. I know that there are a significant amount of parking tickets written in the College Hill area, which would also lend you to believe that parking is an issue, because people wouldn't be getting tickets if they had ample places to park. I understand the development of the hill. You want to spread out. You want to develop C3 down 22nd Street. Great. Do you want to develop 22nd Street into parking lots? Do you want to develop 22nd Street into commercial spaces? Or do you want to develop 22nd Street into apartment buildings? Because from my perspective, I've heard people say, the hill needs more business. We need more business. That's not my experience. We have plenty. But I understand that for some, especially during summer, spring break, when the 11,000 or so some students are not here, it does become a slower time. So how do you get people to come to the Hill? I don't think that another residential building with 120 to 180 people is going to solve the problem. Every fall, you have around 2,000 new freshman students coming to UNI. And they're within a 2-block radius, swarming the area. So it's fresh people. So why aren't they coming to the Hill? I don't think it's because they don't have a place to live, because they're living there. They're living somewhere, and they're living close. So why is the building where the Chinese restaurant rebuilt, why do they still have 2 vacant spaces? Why does the Urban Flats building still have a space that's not filled with its commercial? There are 3 spaces in the College Hill area, commercial, that are not filled and have been that way for almost a year. I would say that maybe parking is an issue, and businesses are afraid to come into an area where they're not guaranteed their clients are going to have access to a place to park. I hear that from my clients every single day. Right now, they're ecstatic. Oh my God, I found a place right out front. I couldn't believe I could pull into that parking lot behind you and find a place to park. They love it. But when August rolls around, it's going to be the other side. I drove around for 10 minutes and couldn't find a place to park at 9 o'clock in the morning. I drove around for 10 minutes looking for a place to park and had to park up the street and around the corner at 4:30 in the afternoon. So if you are going to allow a building that's going to require parking for 120 to 180 people, 180 people would be if 120 beds are occupied by 1.5 people, because at an average rental rate of $600 per bedroom, most students aren't going to pay that by themselves. This project was brought before City Council in March, I believe, with almost the exact same plan, and was denied. What's going to happen when UNI decides to tear down the towers and reconstruct those dorms to be more conforming to what students want now? They want the apartment style living. That's what UNI has been going towards.
I think we're getting a little broad here.
Okay,
So
well, it goes
let's keep
into
it
the,
far from speculation in terms of what UNI is going to be
okay,
doing.
but the height of the building has been compared to the UNI towers and the steeple of the ministry center. It might be an unfair comparison. And I've also heard several times during discussions about this project that we should be trying to become more like Des Moines. And if we want to compare apples to apples, we are nowhere near Des Moines. Des Moines has a population of 215,000 people. Cedar Falls, 41,390. We are more comparable to Urbandale. If we were comparable to Des Moines, our surrounding communities like Janesville, Hudson, Dike, New Hartford, Parkersburg, and Denver would be more like the surrounding communities of Des Moines, like Urbandale, Ankeny, Johnston, Altoona, and Norwalk. And we just don't shine a candle to that. So we need to live within our means. And yes, we need to grow, but we need to grow at a pace that we can maintain and at a pace that is healthy for the community. And if we want to grow business down there, then we need to make it a healthy environment for businesses to grow. And an apartment building with 4 stories of residential apartments and 2 small residential spaces. It's not an entire floor of residential spaces calling for more, or commercial spaces, calling for more commercial business. It's 2 small commercial spaces. To me, that's not inviting a huge amount of commercial opportunity to the Hill. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's anyone who has any new comments they'd like to make or add to the discussion, invite you up before we close public comment on this item.
I just wanted to say something.
Final comments.
I apologize, I spoke out of context earlier. I'm having a hard time hearing tonight, harder than usual, so all the good stuff I said earlier, I want to put it here. I also would urge this to get back to some facts. I mean, this is all of us working together, so I'm not finger pointing here, but the city and the developer, I mean, there's a process to get to here, and then when we're here, we're questioning their intelligence and their motivation for wanting to build this. And I feel like I've taken a trip around the world. Let's, you know, I guess it's fair to say that some people just don't want to see any more development on College Hill. I don't think that's the majority position. I don't think we have enough businesses, and I think we do. I think it is grow or die. And there again, there's people who are much more informed on the code, and obviously what we've learned tonight is it's a very liquid gray area that needs definition. But let's get back to, I mean, I just feel like we're character assassinating the developer, and it's like, let's, you know, what do we have to do to make this work? Let's work together in a process. All right? Thank you.
If we can just, if there are any other public comments, our process is to ask for final public comments and give our applicant a final chance for any response or to address any questions. Okay, seeing none, who would like to?
So we've talked a lot tonight about some of the interests that the city is having to balance and some of the things that you guys are thinking about: parking, development, where are people going to live, where are people going to go shop, where are people going to go eat. And I understand all that. And there's a point there where this question is essentially a legal question, which is, what does the code allow? And if it's a principal commercial use, there's no, then the parking is sufficient as it is with 94 spots because section 29177A and 29160G2 state that if it's a principal commercial use, no parking is required for the commercial use or for the residential use. Now we are, as we've discussed, we're providing 94 spaces, and we're trying to work with the city on that so that there is not this big cliff edge where people have nowhere to park. But there's also a practical aspect to this where if there's 20 people in this apartment building who there's not a designated spot for them, they will make other arrangements. I mean, college students walk, they bike, there's a bus service here, they carpool. I mean, there is a practical side that they are, people will, adults will be able to navigate on their own. But the question here is, what kind of use is this? Commercial use. And then from there it flows that the parking requirements are met. As Dan spoke about earlier, the only way to have a principal commercial use building that is a mixed-use building is if you look at it from the first floor. Otherwise, if you are basing it off of what's the total floor area for the whole building, it can never be a principal commercial use. You could only have a principal residential use. If you have 2 floors of residential, it's 2 to 1. You cannot have a principal commercial use. But that is exactly what the code contemplates and what the code says this is what is preferred. It says this area, College Hill, is supposed to be a principal commercial use area, and that principal residential uses are supposed to be discouraged. So there's kind of a logical impossibility to have a principal commercial use building if you're looking at if the way you're measuring this is looking at the total square footage of the whole building. The only reasonable way to look at this is to just look at the main floor, what's referred to as the main floor in 29160 G2, which is the first floor, the street level floor, and in this case, that's a commercial floor. It's 64% commercial, 34% parking, and then a very small area for basically a lobby, elevator shafts for the residential units, because there has to be a way for residents to actually get up there into the upper floors. There also is specific references to residential uses on the upper floors. Floors plural. This contemplates 2, 3, 4 stories of residential uses above a commercial use. And one last point I wanted to make here is that our client, the developer here, has a record of high-quality developments, of working with the city and providing places for people to live, to work, to shop, and so forth. And that, based on their research, they've determined that there is a market for people who would live in this type of development, who would be happy, to get a leasehold interest in one of these places. And their research shows it. There's a demand for it. It may not be what most people in Cedar Falls do, or most people in most parts of the state, the way they live, but there is a market for that. So with that, I ask you to approve this plan as you did back in late January, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Any questions for our applicant? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, at this point, we'll end public comment in the commission. Questions for staff or discussion?
I guess I'll go first. It seems to me that it's a difficult issue because there are parts of it that I agree with on each side. I guess I look toward the comprehensive plan, and it strives for density. And I ask myself, what are my favorite parts of this city? And they're the parts of the city with the least amount of parking. And I think we would get consensus about that broadly from the community. But I think the question is what level of density? And that's, to me, where the nuance lies a bit. Because I don't feel like the code maybe applies to this level of density, or maybe imagine this level of density. I guess that's speculation on my part. But I think the density is good, and I think it's proven to be good for the city, and it's where the comprehensive plan is taking us. So it's difficult, but I go back to that we need to follow the code. And I commend staff for really digging deep into this. And we as a commission rely on staff to interpret these things and give us advice legally, and this is what you all do, and you've done a good job with that. And so I guess I have to defer to that personally, because it is a very complex issue. I guess I would say that I would like to see the council provide the resources and staffing that allows us to reevaluate our zoning in a significant way, because I think that it doesn't imagine these kinds of projects that our commission is dealing with at this time, very clearly, at least in my mind. And I guess that's it.
Yeah, Brad, I agree with the statement there about both sides. We've heard, obviously, both sides of this discussion and included with the city staff, and we have the information that was provided here and with the PowerPoint is good, because it does get to see the other part of the things that you were dealing with, and that's what we're sort of missing last time. And I agree that we've got a good view there. I think the other part of this, and granted, it's, okay, so it's not going to be a perfect walk-up deal with every single car is going to be in every place every time, but where do you start? I think this is the point where you start the development or redevelopment of College Hill. And you start the redevelopment of 22nd Street that, quite honestly, it's kind of a place where time has passed by. And there's houses that in certain parts of town would probably not exactly be something you'd want to have next door to you. So I think this is a good spot where 22nd Street can have a totally different look and really kind of start over. And yes, I agree, the gray area there about the, whether it's a required parking and a principal use and all these things, yeah, okay, maybe that's for another time, but with the rules we have are the rules we have today. And I think you have to make a judgment call on that. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I see it differently because I can't get over the basic thing that principal use is residential.
Yeah.
And parking then is required under the current ordinance. If we want to change it, we could change it so it's clear what that requirement is, because I don't think it was ever intended to be zero. And maybe what we have is too much, but I can't approve something on a project, because then you don't have any standards as far as I'm concerned going forward. We should go back, change the ordinance, so then any project that comes has to, or clarify the ordinance or whatever you want to say, I think, in order so that any project coming forward then is under the same rules, because the next project that comes in is not under these rules, because this is just an arbitrary agreement to add parking in. And so what do we do the next time? I mean, to me, there's no guideline then. And for the city to treat different projects that are the same with a different standard, that's a problem, I think. I like the project. I don't have a problem with the project. It would be a great project. But we have to have the same standard for everything that comes through here. And we're not doing that. We're going down a different path. And, I'd love to see them figure out a way to do this, but I don't think we can just jump in here and arbitrarily say, oh yeah, we're going to, 94 stalls is what we need now. How did we get there? It just doesn't seem fair. You got all these other developers who have done things, or every other project, and they've done a certain thing, and now we're saying, this looks good. I mean, it's a good-looking project. I don't have any problem with the density. I think the density is good.
Yep.
There's got to be some equality in every project and how they're treated, and to me, this is just arbitrary.
Well, Marty, I guess if this was R4, we'd know what the rules are, right?
Right.
Yeah. So it's not.
Well, you can treat it as R4.
Yeah, well, you could, but that's not what's intended. Yeah. With this zoning.
Well, I mean, if you treat the principal use as residential, then R4 applies. If that's
right.
I have a concern because I heard that if it's C3, parking is not required. Karen said that, staff said that, and I heard that from the applicant. Yet they're asking for land use and rezoning change to put in a parking lot. And yet it was also stated that they may not have to put in a parking lot. They could decide to do something else with that once it's zoned C3. I believe that's what was said. So I have a concern with that. And then secondly, I just agree with Marty in that I cannot vote for this based on it's a cool project. I love it. But it's again, we have to stick with the code, and my question comes back again, if they just, it is C3, and staff has said they don't have to provide any parking, where are the people going to park? I still have that question. Where will they park? So that's where I stand.
Are we suggesting that all C3 requires parking? Even a one-story housing over retail? That should be the case?
Well, if the commercial is a principal use, that's a different story, right? We have that. You know, that's what's happened with those two-story buildings where the, you know, you got residential over commercial on a single floor.
We don't have, you know, for a mixed-use building, you know, if it's a mixed-use building and there's a percentage one way or the other, there's not any equation to tell you how much parking that requires. And that would solve our problem on a mixed-use building.
Well, the commercial space in C3 doesn't require parking, regardless of how much there is.
Correct.
Yeah.
But we're in new territory with mixed use, pushing high density, you know, wanting high density mixed use buildings. Well, what's the definition of what the requirement will be? And we're debating what's the principal use. Well, if there was an equation and you put something to it, it would solve that debate.
Yeah, to your point, I think there needs to be something that a little more clearly defines what we're talking about here before we move ahead with something.
But this building is 78% parked? Is that the correct figure I had heard?
No.
96, well, what was the number? It was almost 80%, wasn't it?
No.
80% park?
78%?
No,
Fire room.
if it were R4, which it says if principal use is residential, and we'd have to go back to the R4 requirements, which require 196 parking stalls.
And we're at 90.
And there's 94. So I agree with Marty, then we need to go ask council for resources to go back and decide what is mixed-use parking requirement going to be, because we're going to have the same problem in another area of Cedar Falls, and that's the central district.
We talked about this last time. Is the resistance to addressing the mixed-use building and parking more specifically?
I don't think there's any resistance to that. That's not the application we have
Right.
for you today. I think there is a lot of good discussion here about mixed-use buildings, and Cedar Falls is experiencing a number of new mixed-use buildings, and I think there's a number of different ways that you can allow mixed-use buildings and talk about principal and accessory or more than one principal use in a building, and decide how you want to park those buildings. We're just trying to address what the code says right now versus what we would like it to be might be something different.
Right. I think we're all in agreement clarification is needed. I think we're all in agreement that this project feels right in terms of its density. I guess that's why I support it.
I guess from the last thing we approved over the winter to now, we've got a better project than we had the last time, based off of the comments that came through. There is more parking than was before. The extra lots are helpful. That was the safety valve we're kind of looking for there, at least a few of them. Now, granted, it's not all of those, but it's a better project than it was that we approved it the last time. So, I guess.
I guess I'll throw out a motion and we'll find out where it lands, but I would move that we approve the project.
There's a motion to approve. Is there a second?
I'd second that.
There's a A motion and a second. Please go ahead and vote. We have 3 ayes and 4 noes on that item. So that item is not approved. That concludes our agenda items. And I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
All those in favor signify with aye.
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 Opposed, nay? Thank you. We are adjourned.